Have you ever felt that chill down your spine when you hear stories that seem to only exist in horror movies? Now imagine this happening in one of the most innocent places of childhood, a treehouse. But these are no ordinary houses. They hide dark secrets and stories so scary that you'll think twice before looking at one up close. In this video, you'll discover the most terrifying stories of tree houses you've ever heard. Get ready, because today I'm going to take you to places where fear comes to life, and the only way out is to face your worst nightmares. Are you ready? A long time ago, in a very quiet town, rumors arose about tree houses, but they were no ordinary houses. These houses were different because no one dared to go near them. They said they were abandoned houses, made of old and broken wood, and that they were located in the middle of a very dark and dense forest. The strangest thing of all is that from time to time, someone would see something or hear strange sounds coming from there, as if these houses were alive. Some spoke of a presence, something or someone, that made the forest even more frightening. The locals always said, "Don't go near these houses, they are cursed." And afraid no one dared to approach to investigate. But of course, there are always those curious people, right? And that's where the story began. John was one of those curious people. He had always loved mystery stories and was always reading books about scary places, strange creatures, and unexplained phenomena. So when he heard the rumors about the tree houses, something inside him couldn't resist. This has to be true, he thought. He had heard stories of people who claimed to have seen strange things, but no one had the courage to go there. John, however, was different. He wasn't afraid. His heart beat faster just thinking about the stories he could tell if he went there. So, the following weekend, he grabbed his backpack, grabbed a flashlight, and ventured into the forest. His friends warned him, "John, this is dangerous, don't go." But he was determined. "I'm just going to take a look, nothing more," he said, trying to convince himself. And so, he set off on a journey into the unknown. It was a grey afternoon when John began walking along the trail that led to the forest. The air was cold and heavy, and the silence seemed different, as if nature itself was waiting for something to happen. As he walked, the trees grew taller, the branches intertwined in the sky, blocking the light, and the trail seemed to never end. At first, everything seemed peaceful, but as night approached, the sounds around him began to change. Footsteps? No, maybe it was just the wind, or were they leaves? John stopped for a moment, trying to listen better, but there was no one there. At least, that's what he wanted to believe. With each step, the forest grew denser and he began to feel something strange, as if he were being watched. But he shook his head, laughed at himself and thought, "It must be just my imagination." Even so, he gripped the flashlight in his hand tighter and continued on, ignoring the shiver that ran down his spine. Finally, after hours of walking, he saw something in the distance, a tall shadow in the middle of the trees. It was the first treehouse. As Jack got closer, he realized that the treehouse was even scarier than he had imagined. It looked abandoned for years. The wood was dark, covered in moss, and had some broken parts. The branches of the tree wrapped around it, as if they were protecting or holding the house. He looked up and saw a wooden ladder hanging down, swaying slightly in the wind. For a moment, he thought about giving up. Should I really climb it? But his curiosity got the better of him. With a sigh, he began to climb, step by step. The ladder creaked with each step, as if it were about to break, but he kept going. When he finally reached the top, he stood still for a moment, trying to make sense of what he saw. The inside of the house was almost empty, but there were a few things scattered around. A rocking chair that looked like it had never been touched, a table covered in dust, and marks on the floor. They looked like footprints, too small to be those of an adult. Has someone been here? He thought. It was then that he noticed something in the corner of the room. A toy. It was an old teddy bear with one of its eyes missing. and next to it a childish drawing stuck to the wall, showing the treehouse, but with shadowy figures around it. John's heart raced. "This isn't normal," he whispered to himself, but before he could leave, he heard a sound. A low noise, like the dragging of something heavy on the floor. Coming from upstairs? John froze. The sound continued, a slow, almost rhythmic dragging. He looked at the stairs that led to the upper floor. Maybe it's an animal, or just the wind, he thought, trying to calm himself. But his curiosity left no room for retreat. He needed to know what was happening there. With slow, careful steps, he began to climb the stairs. Each step creaked under his feet, as if the wood wanted to warn him not to continue. When he reached the top, he saw a small room lit only by the moonlight that filtered through the gaps in the boards. The sound had stopped, but the feeling that something was wrong only grew. John took another step and looked around. There was nothing there, just the unsettling silence and the wind shaking the boards of the wall. He almost laughed at himself. "I'm scaring myself for nothing," he said, as he turned to go downstairs. It was then that he saw it. In the window, a dark figure stood, just a silhouette against the moonlight. John couldn't make out a face, but he could feel that he was being watched. He held his breath, feeling his heart beat so hard it seemed to echo through the house. When he blinked, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. A chill ran down his spine. He quickly went downstairs, but when he reached the bottom floor, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. The teddy bear had been moved, now lying in the middle of the room, as if someone had put it there on purpose. "This isn't possible," he whispered, but he knew he had to get out of there as quickly as possible. There, before we continue with the video, just check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because here we will bring a series of videos like this, with incredible, terrifying stories for you. Continuing. Hansel climbed down from the treehouse in a desperate hurry, his feet slipping on the rungs as the ladder creaked beneath his weight. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. When he finally reached the ground, he paused for a moment, bent over on his knees trying to catch his breath. But the air seemed thicker, heavier, as if the forest were enveloping him, holding him there. He took a few steps, looking back just to make sure the treehouse was still where it should be, motionless in the branches. He tried to convince himself that everything was okay, but the feeling of being watched remained, now stronger than ever. It was then that he heard it. A soft sound, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, made him stop in his tracks. "John." The word seemed to float around him, as if the air itself had pronounced his name. He froze in place, feeling a shiver run down his spine. The voice was distant, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. John turned abruptly, pointing the flashlight in the direction of the house. But it was there, still, motionless, as silent as before. He shook his head, trying to push away the thoughts. "I must be hearing things," he murmured, although his voice sounded weak and unconvincing even to himself. He kept walking, trying to get away from that place, but after a few steps the voice returned. This time it was closer, clearer. "John, come back." It was a feminine voice, delicate but filled with something indescribable. It wasn't just the tone that bothered him, but the way it seemed to come from all sides, echoing between the trees, as if the forest itself was speaking to him. He turned his body, frantically shining his light on the trunks around him. But there was no one there. It was then that he noticed something even more disturbing. The forest was completely silent. No sound of wind, no rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, just absolute silence. It was as if the world had stopped breathing. John began to walk faster, his mind screaming to get out of there as quickly as possible, but his feet felt heavy, as if something invisible was holding him in place. Fear began to turn him into despair. He tried to scream, but his voice came out shaky. "Who's there?" he asked, turning his body and sweeping the flashlight in all directions. There was no answer, but then he saw it. In the shadows of the forest, something moved. At first it seemed like just a blur, a subtle shift in the darkness, but when he focused his flashlight, he could make out a silhouette. It was small, almost like a child standing between the trees, watching him. Hansel felt a lump in his throat, his feet digging into the ground as if they had roots. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, moving a little further out of the shadows. He couldn't see its face, but there was something terribly wrong about its presence. Every fiber of Hansel's body screamed to run, but he was frozen, as if the thing's gaze had trapped him. Then, like a snap in his mind, he moved. He turned abruptly and began to run, ignoring the branches that scratched his face and the bushes that tore at his clothes. The flashlight swung wildly in his hand, illuminating flashes of the forest as he ran, but the voice wouldn't let him. "John, don't go." She seemed closer now, almost beside him, and each word was like a cold breath on the back of his neck. He didn't dare look back. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to keep running. So he kept going without direction, just moving away from that place, while the voice persisted, echoing in his mind, like a promise that it wasn't over yet. John ran through the forest as if his life depended on it, and maybe it did. The trees seemed to get closer and closer, their twisted branches scraping against his face and arms as he struggled to find his way out of this dark place. The flashlight shook in his hands, casting intermittent light that barely illuminated the path ahead, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly, his feet encountered an exposed root, causing him to stumble violently. He fell to the damp ground, feeling the resistance of the compacted earth beneath him. The flashlight rolled a few feet ahead, still glowing, but out of his immediate reach. John tried to reach for the light, but felt a sharp cut in his palm as the sharp leaves on the ground touched his skin. The throbbing pain almost distracted him, but he knew he couldn't stop now. Getting up was a Herculean effort. His legs were shaking, and he felt hot blood rushing down his face as he tried to compose himself. When he finally reached the flashlight, his sweaty hand managed to grab it, bringing it back to his side. But then he stopped abruptly, frozen in mid-step. It was there. The shadowy figure he had seen before was standing next to the flashlight. Now, with the light focused, he could see it better. A tall silhouette with imprecise contours, as if it were made of dense smoke and dissolving in the air. The presence was cold and oppressive, and John felt a shiver run down his spine. He tried to scream, but his voice seemed stuck in his throat, unable to make any sound. The figure had no face, but John could feel that he was being watched intently, as if invisible eyes were boring into his soul. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, unable to move. The figure began to move toward him slowly and deliberately, without any sign of hesitation or emotion. Each step it took made the air around it feel thicker, harder to breathe. John backed away, his feet slipping on the damp leaves on the ground. "What do you want?" he shouted, finally finding his voice, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it merely extended a long, thin arm, pointing directly at him, as if leveling a silent accusation. It was then that John realized something terrible. The sound of the voice that had called his name before was not coming from far away. It was coming from that figure. The same feminine voice, soft but charged with an intensity that made him tremble with fear. "Joan," she whispered, her voice reverberating in the absolute silence of the forest. He knew he had to get out of there, but his body would not move. It was as if he were trapped in a nightmare, where each second seemed like an eternity of terror and uncertainty. The figure advanced slowly, and Joan felt every fiber of his being begging him to escape that terrifying encounter. And then, With a superhuman effort, he managed to take a step back, feeling the branches of the trees tearing his clothes and scratching his skin. Panic took over his body, driving him to keep running. Each step he took him further away from the figure, but the feeling of being chased did not diminish. He started running faster, his feet slamming wildly on the wet ground, while the trees seemed to stretch endlessly in his path. The flashlight swung frantically in his hand, casting flickering lights that barely managed to illuminate the path ahead. The sound of the voice continued to echo in his mind, getting closer and more insistent. This time, Joan didn't look back. He knew that if he did, he wouldn't be able to keep running. He focused on finding a way out, ignoring the shadows that stretched across the forest, as if they were trying to swallow him. The voice, now closer, seemed to scream directly into his mind. "John, don't go!" Desperation drove him, making him run at a speed he had never experienced before. His legs burned, his breathing was heavy and irregular, but he didn't stop. The only thing that mattered was escaping that dark presence that relentlessly pursued him. Finally, after what seemed like hours of desperate running, John spotted an opening in the dense vegetation. It was the exit from the forest. He gave it his all, running toward the light that now shone in front of him, leaving behind the darkness and terror that had nearly consumed him. As he walked away, the shadowy figure disappeared into the darkness. As if it had never been there, John fell to his knees, panting and shaking, looking back one last time. The forest was silent, but the feeling of being watched remained, a constant reminder that some mysteries should never be solved. So had you ever heard of treehouse stories? Leave a comment with what you know about this and if you believe in these stories. Moving on, John ran without stopping, feeling his heart beating wildly, as if it would explode at any moment. His legs ached, every muscle begged for rest, but he didn't dare stop. The trees around him formed shadows that seemed to close in on him, almost like hands trying to pull him back into the terror he was leaving behind. The voice, once so close, now sounded distant, like a persistent echo that refused to disappear. When he saw the clearing, it was as if a spark of hope was rekindled in his chest. In the center, a treehouse stood out, different from the previous one. It was smaller, with a simpler and less threatening appearance. It didn't seem abandoned, but it didn't seem inhabited either. John hesitated for a moment, but exhaustion and despair spoke louder. "If I hide there, maybe I can get some time to think," he muttered, his eyes fixed on the rope ladder swaying gently in the wind. He ran toward the house and began climbing, each step creaking under his weight. But the structure seemed sturdier than the first house. When he reached the top, he quickly entered and closed the small door behind him. Inside, the space was simple. The walls made of poorly fitted planks, the floor covered in dust, and in the center, a dark wooden chest. Joan threw himself into the opposite corner, trying to control his labored breathing, while his eyes ran around the interior in search of something, anything, that he could use to protect himself. The small house seemed safe, but there was a strange energy there, something that John could not define. His gaze returned to the chest. It was large, with rusty hardware and signs of use. But what caught his attention most was the way it seemed to call to him. Joan tried to ignore the impulse, but it was as if the object had an inexplicable magnetism. Slowly, he approached, kneeling in front of it. His hands shook as he lifted the heavy lid, which creaked like a muffled scream in the stillness of the cabin. Inside the trunk, he found an old journal, its leather cover cracked with age and its pages yellowed and fragile. The writing inside was hurried, almost illegible, but it carried an urgency that made John even more apprehensive. He read the first few words with difficulty, his heart racing as the story took shape. The pages told of a family who had lived in those tree houses many years ago. The houses, apparently, were used as a refuge from something that lived in the forest, something that was chasing them. As John read on, the words became more disorganized, almost incoherent, as if the writer were terrified. The last entry was short, but its words seemed to whisper directly into John's ear. If you hear the voice, do not follow it, do not look at it, do not answer. He read that sentence over and over, unable to shake the chill that ran down his spine. It was exactly what he had been hearing all night. The voice, he murmured, feeling a lump in his throat. Who was that figure? What was that? He slammed the diary shut, trying to control the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. It was then that a strong wind swept through the cabin, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into a suffocating darkness. The entire house seemed to shudder, and the sound of creaking boards echoed in the silence. Hansel huddled in the corner, trying to hold his breath. He knew something was wrong, very wrong. And then he heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured, and unmistakable. They were coming from the rope ladder. They climbed one step at a time, getting closer and closer. Hansel clutched the diary to his chest as if it could somehow protect him. His heart was pounding so hard, he feared the sound would give him away. It can't be real. It can't be real, he whispered to himself, trying desperately to believe that it was just his imagination. But the footsteps continued, and with them, the voice returned. Hansel, I'm coming. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and Hansel felt that the real terror was about to begin. John remained motionless, feeling the air as heavy as lead around him. The sound of footsteps had ceased, but the tension in the cabin was unbearable. He huddled in his corner, every muscle in his body rigid with fear. He could hear the sound of his heart echoing in his ears, his short, accelerated breaths betraying the terror that was taking over his mind. Then the silence was broken by a dry and unexpected sound. Knock, knock, knock. Someone was knocking on the wood of the entrance. John widened his eyes, unable to believe what he was hearing. The knocking sounded methodical, almost mocking, as if the entity was toying with him. He wanted to scream, but his throat felt blocked. It was at that moment that something happened. Slowly, on the dusty floor of the cabin, a shadow began to form, although there was no light to cast it. It was long and distorted, growing and stretching until it filled much of the space around it. The shape was human, but its contours seemed to vibrate, as if they were made of living smoke. The atmosphere grew even denser, and a chill ran down John's spine. John, the whisper came from all sides, enveloping him completely. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried something deep, sadness, anger, despair. He tried to retreat, but he was trapped. There was nowhere to run. The figure, now fully formed, seemed to stare at him even though its eyes were not visible. It was tall, overwhelming in presence, and seemed to absorb all the light around it. When it finally spoke again, its voice was clear, but full of melancholy. Why have you come here? John felt a lump in his throat, but he gathered what little courage he had left to answer, even though his voice was trembling. Who are you? What do you want from me? The figure remained still for a moment, as if pondering the question. Then he answered with palpable bitterness, I was like you, too curious, ignoring the warnings, and now I'm stuck here, forever. The floor of the cabin seemed to shake beneath John's feet. The feeling of stability began to disappear, as if gravity were breaking. Everything around him began to spin slowly, and the cabin seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The voice grew more intense, filling every corner of the space. You will be too, like all the others who came before you. Panicking, John grabbed the diary he was still holding. His hands shook as he opened it and frantically flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything that might help him. The words seemed blurry, but then he found a hastily scrawled, almost erased sentence. The only way out is to not be afraid. Don't let it control you. He swallowed hard. How could he not be afraid? The shadowy figure in front of him was the very embodiment of terror. But he knew that if he didn't try, he was doomed. John closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath and clenched his fists. His hands were still shaking, but he forced his voice out, at first in a whisper, I'm not afraid of you." The figure didn't react. Then, with all the strength he could muster, John shouted, facing the void in front of him, "I'm not afraid of you. I will not be like you." The shadow hesitated. Its once solid outline began to fade, like smoke blown by the wind. The space around John began to distort, the walls of the cabin shaking and disappearing, revealing the forest beyond. The figure let out a deep, piercing scream that seemed to carry all the pain that had accumulated over decades. The shadow dissipated, fragment by fragment, until there was nothing left but silence. The clearing was now empty, and John was alone again. He fell to his knees, the journal slipping from his hands. The sky above was beginning to lighten, as if the very environment were breaking free of a curse. He had faced his fear, and because of that, he had survived. Well, we are already revealing more and more about this story, but before I continue, I realize that you still haven't liked this video. This is very important for YouTube to help promote our content. So, leave your like on this video, which is free, okay? Continuing, when the shadow finally disappeared, the cabin returned to normal. But Hansel wasted no time. He ran down the rope ladder, clutching the diary to his chest, and ran through the forest without looking back. The feeling of being watched still followed him, but the voice, that frightening voice, had gone silent. The branches seemed to part, and the path that had been confusing before now appeared clear before him. Hansel ran like never before, feeling the cold wind cut his face. It was only when he saw the lights of the road that he realized he was finally free. He fell to his knees, panting, looking back once more. The forest was quiet still, but something inside him told him he should never go back. Before getting up, he opened the diary one last time, this time in the moonlight. On the last page, there was a message he had not seen before. The words seemed freshly written. "You escaped this time, but others will come, and not everyone will be so lucky." John closed the diary with trembling hands, promising himself that he would never again let his curiosity get the better of him. He left the forest, but the weight of that night would follow him forever. After that night, Juan was never the same again. The mystery of the tree houses was etched in his memory as a reminder that some curiosities can cost him dearly. And you? How far would you go to unravel a dark secret? Remember, not everyone who enters comes back to tell the tale. But here, you discovered the most terrifying stories about tree houses, and now it's up to you to decide. Courage to explore or wisdom to avoid. If you like this story and want more like it, subscribe and share your impressions in the comments. But be careful. Some answers can be scarier than the questions. Thank you for watching so far. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue receiving the next content. Until the next video.